Hi everyone, this is William, and I'm here with part two of a four-part series of comparisons or versus. The first one was open back headphones versus closed back headphones, the advantages and disadvantages of each. And this video is dynamic driver headphones versus planar magnetic driver headphones. And it's also about the advantages and disadvantages of each type of headphone. And I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the noise from the air conditioner and the fan behind me, but it was another really hot day today, and it's just too hot to not have them on, so please excuse the noise. So anyway, first I want to talk about these two types of headphones and the difference in the drivers. Dynamic drivers are very similar to what you would find in most speakers. You have either a cone or a dome that has a voice coil attached to it, usually made of aluminum or copper, and then that's surrounded by a magnet, and when the signal is run through that coil, it causes the driver or the cone to move in and out in a piston motion, and that's what creates the sound. And a planar magnetic driver is a little bit different. What a planar magnetic driver does is, instead of a cone or a driver, it uses a sheet of usually some sort of polymer, and it's usually a little bit bigger, where dynamic drivers are usually in the 40 millimeter to 50 millimeter range. Some can go bigger, but anyway, the planar magnetics usually use a diaphragm that's like 80, even 100 millimeters. And it's a polymer, and what they do is they put etchings on it, usually made of aluminum, in a pattern or a zigzag or whatever. And then originally it was both sides, they would have a bank of magnets that went across the diaphragm. And when you ran a current through this aluminum tracing on this, it would react with the magnets and vibrate, and that's what would cause or create your music. More modern planar magnetic driver or headphones, a lot of them usually are only use magnets on one side now, and this helps hold weight down. Some of the originals were real heavy. So anyway, I'm going to start with dynamic drivers and the advantages. And one of the primary advantages is usually a lower cost. And I did want to point out that things are changing every day. Huge advances in both dynamic driver headphones and especially planar magnetic driver headphones have been made in the last few years. Until maybe about 10 years ago, there were very few planar magnetic driver headphones, and now you're getting where there's more and more. Well, anyway, when I say lower cost is an advantage of the dynamic drivers, I mean you can get dynamic driver headphones all the way down to $20, $30, where planar magnetic headphones, up until probably 5 years ago, you couldn't get one for under $500, where you can now. Hi-Fi Man has the HE400 SE, which is a planar magnetic driver headphone that now sells for $109. So the prices are getting a lot closer than they used to be, but you can still usually get dynamic driver headphones at a lower cost. Usually the dynamic driver headphones have a lighter weight because they use a smaller driver, but this isn't always the case. And as I go through this list of advantages and disadvantages of both, I can assure you there are exceptions to every one of these. I'm just going by my 4 years or whatever I've been doing reviews, my experience, and what I've seen. But everything I am pointing out, I'm sure you can come up with an exception. So if you want to make a list of comments, 100 comments long, telling me all the exceptions, that's fine. But I know there's a lot of them out there. Normally, in most cases, a dynamic driver headphone is going to require less power from your amp. Unless it's a high impedance, dynamic driver, then it will require more voltage and a more substantial amp, probably a desktop amp, probably not a phone, but usually low impedance dynamic driver headphones are very easy to drive, and you can drive them with almost anything, and you don't need to spend a lot of money on an amp. Dynamic drivers usually have more mid-bass punch than planar magnetic headphones, but once again, there are exceptions. The new Hi-Fi Man Aria Stealth, well, not new, but the latest Aria Stealth is a very dynamic, very punchy headphone. And there are a few planar headphones that are dynamic, but in general, I would say the dynamic driver headphones usually have a little more punch in the mid-bass, and they're usually a little more dynamic throughout the frequency range. A lot of people feel that dynamic driver headphones have a more natural sound, and I tend to agree with that. I think they do. They sound more like speakers because most speakers do use dynamic type drivers, so maybe that's just what we're used to, but I think most people would agree that dynamic driver headphones just have more of a natural, more organic sound to them. Up until very recently, if you wanted a closed back headphone, dynamic drivers was pretty much your only choice. There were very few planar magnetic headphones that were closed back, but that has changed in the last couple of years. Several companies, Odyssey was one of the first to come out with planar magnetic drivers and a closed back headphone, and just recently Kennerton came out with their first closed back planar magnetic headphone, the Ragnar. So anyway, if you're a bass head, you're probably going to do better with a dynamic driver headphone. Number one, because like I said a minute ago, they are more punchy and have a more dynamic mid-bass, but just for some reason you just can't get a huge amount of bass out of planar magnetic headphones the way you usually can with dynamic drivers, and that's one of the other advantages of dynamic drivers is they usually respond better to EQ, especially if you're trying to boost the bass. If you boost the bass on most planar magnetic headphones, you can get away with maybe 3, 4, 5 decibels of boost, but beyond that, it just seems to distort the bass and make it muddy. Where dynamic driver headphones, you can put a lot more boost to the bass. You can hit them with 10, 12 decibels of boost, and they can handle it. And so I would say, especially if you're trying to boost the bass, dynamic driver headphones usually respond a lot better to EQs. Up in the higher frequencies, it's not so much the case. I think planar magnetics respond to EQ pretty well in the higher frequencies. Usually a dynamic driver headphone is a smaller size, but that's not always the case either. There are some very large dynamic headphones, and I wanted to point out the photo behind me on the monitor, and that would be on the left, the ZMF Atrium, which I just recently reviewed, which is a dynamic driver open back headphone, and the headphone on the right is the Kennerton Odin, which is a planar magnetic open back headphone, and those had a similar cost, and those are two of my favorite headphones. I love both of those headphones. So anyway, just wanted to point that out. Another advantage to dynamic driver headphones is they usually have a little less sound leakage than the planar magnetics. There's usually, if you have an open back headphone, if it's closed it doesn't matter because closed usually hold the music in. But if you have an open back headphone with a dynamic driver, usually less sound comes off the back of the dynamic drivers than comes off the back of the planars. The planars usually put an equal amount of sound forward or in and out, where the dynamic driver headphones usually have some sort of enclosure on the back of the driver and put most of the sound out the front, which puts the sound in. So they do have a little less leakage of your music. They still have some on an open back, but not as much as the planars. Okay, the disadvantages of dynamic driver headphones. They usually have, and this isn't always the case, but they usually have a little less bass extension into the really low frequencies, the way the dynamic drivers, or the way the planar magnetic drivers do. And there are exceptions. Right there behind me, the ZMF Atrium extends very well into the sub bass, but that is kind of an exception. In most cases, your dynamic drivers are going to have more mid-bass punch, but less extension into the really low frequencies. Also, the dynamic drivers tend to have a little bit less extension into the high treble frequencies. Not always the case. There are some dynamic drivers that get way up there in the treble, but I would say in most cases, my experience have been dynamic drivers usually roll off at a little lower point than the planar magnetics do. This is another thing that I know you're going to come up with a ton of exceptions. I would say in most cases, dynamic drivers have a slightly smaller soundstage than planar magnetics. And I'm talking about mostly width and height. Not always the case. Once again, the ZMF behind me, the Atrium, has a very large soundstage, but it's sort of the exception. There isn't usually a huge difference, but I would say in general, most planar magnetics have a slightly larger soundstage than the dynamic driver headphones do. The dynamic drivers usually have slightly slower transients. They're a little bit slower about going from one note to another, or from one instrument to another. The reaction's a little bit slower. The planar magnetic headphones have extremely thin, extremely light diaphragms, and they just tend to be quicker about transitioning from one sound to another than the dynamic drivers do. But once again, I'm sure there are exceptions. It's been my experience that most dynamic driver headphones have slightly less detail and clarity than the planar magnetics. It's not always the case. I've not heard it or reviewed it, but the Focal Utopia is a dynamic driver and is supposed to have exceptional detail. Another headphone I could point out is the LSA HP2 Ultra. That is a dynamic driver headphone that sells for about $800, and it has exceptional detail. And I can even point out a budget headphone, the Grotto SR80E, that sold for $100, has very good detail for a dynamic driver headphone. So there are exceptions, but I would say in general, planar magnetic headphones usually have slightly more detail and slightly more clarity. I would also say that in most cases, dynamic headphones have a little less pinpoint imaging than the planar magnetics. Not always the case, once again, but it seems like most planar magnetics just have you can pinpoint where each instrument's coming from just a little bit better with the planar magnetic headphones. Another disadvantage to dynamic drivers is if they do have high impedance, which isn't a bad thing. Usually high impedance headphones are more expensive, but high impedance headphones usually require a more substantial amp. High impedance headphones need amps that can put out a lot of voltage, and that's going to rule out your phone and most tablets and things like that. Most of your budget portable amps aren't going to put out the voltage. more expensive desktop amps are going to work a lot better with high impedance headphones, and tube amps are going to work even better because tube amps are all about voltage. They don't put out a whole lot of current, especially OTL type tube amps, but they can put out a lot of voltage, and that's exactly what high impedance dynamic driver headphones need, is a lot of voltage. So high impedance dynamic driver headphones and tube amps, especially OTL type tube amps, are an excellent match and usually sound really great together. Okay, let's talk about planar magnetic driver headphones, and I'll start with the advantages. In most cases, I think they have slightly more detail and slightly better clarity, but once again, not always the case. I think that the planar magnetic headphones in general usually have a slightly larger sound stage, but once again, there are some dynamic driver headphones like the Atrium that have a very large sound stage. I would say planar magnetics usually have slightly more precise imaging where the sounds are a little bit more pinpoint where they're located. I definitely think the planar magnetics have a little faster transients where they transition from one note or one sound to another a little bit quicker. And once again, it's that really lightweight, really thin polymer diaphragm that just can move faster and react faster than the usually heavier cone or dome in your dynamic headphones. To me, I think that most planar magnetic headphones have a little bit better separation of instruments, but there are dynamic headphones that have very good separation up there along with the best of the planars. It's been my experience that planar magnetic headphones usually have a little bit better bass extension than dynamics, but once again, the dynamics usually have more punch to the mid bass, so you get that better extension into the really low frequencies, but it usually doesn't have as much weight, where the dynamic headphones don't go as low but are a little more dynamic, a little more punchy in that mid bass. One of the advantages, which is a new thing with the planar magnetics, is they're a lot lighter than they used to be. The early planar magnetic headphones were very heavy. I know, like, my first planar magnetic headphone was the Hi-Fi Man HE500, and it had magnets on both sides of the diaphragm, and I think it weighed well over 500 grams. Very heavy headphone. Heavy headphones don't really bother me, so that wasn't really an issue, but in most cases your planars are going to be heavier, but the newer ones are getting lighter and lighter all the time. They're a lot lighter than they were in the past. The price used to be a big disadvantage for the planar magnetic drivers. Like just a couple of years ago, you couldn't get a planar magnetic driver headphone for probably under $250. Now you can get it for $109. So what used to be a big disadvantage is now kind of neutralized, and there's not near as much of a difference between the prices. Although there are some very expensive planar magnetic headphones, like say the Suspara, the Abyss, things like that. But I think Spirit Torino has an $11,000 headphone out that's a dynamic driver. So there's very expensive headphones of both types. And I think in most cases, especially in the mid-range and treble, I think planar magnetic headphones have a little less distortion. But if you try to boost the bass with an equalizer, they distort pretty easily in the bass. So I think the dynamic drivers probably have a little less distortion in the bass, especially in songs that are bass heavy or if you're trying to boost the bass. But I think planar magnetics have an advantage in the mids and the treble, that they're a little cleaner and a little less distorted. But once again, I'm sure there's exceptions. Okay, the disadvantages of planar magnetic headphones. They've been around a lot less time. There were a few, I think even 20, 30 years ago, there was a couple of planar magnetic headphones around. Excuse me just a second. But in general, probably wasn't until, I don't know, around 2010 or so that, and I think it was Hi-Fi Man that really started pushing the planar magnetic designs. I know, like I said, I've got the HE500 back in 2012, and I think it was a few years before that, that Hi-Fi Man had a couple of versions before the 500, the HE500, and they're the ones that really got the planar magnetics going. And now, I mean, there's so many companies making them, and like I said earlier, it used to be almost impossible to find closed-back planar magnetic headphones, which was a big disadvantage. But now there's more and more closed-back planar magnetic headphones coming out. So as time goes by, a lot of the disadvantages of the planar magnetics, like weight and cost, have come down a lot, and they're a lot closer to their competitors with the dynamic drivers. The early planar magnetic headphones were very heavy. They still are usually, in most cases, a little heavier than the dynamic drivers, but not always. There are some planar magnetic headphones that are pretty light now. I mean, you're not going to find super light planar magnetics, but some of them are, you know, in the middle range of weight for a full-size headphone. Like I mentioned, back in 2012, I don't think you could buy a planar magnetic headphone for under $700. And as recent as probably 2 years ago, you couldn't get one for under $250, but the price keeps coming down, so that's a disadvantage that's not as drastic as it used to be. Planar, here's the big thing. Here's what a lot of people don't realize when they buy planar magnetic headphones. The design of planar magnetic headphones usually requires a lot of current from your amp. They're usually low impedance, anywhere from like 20 ohms to 50 ohms, but they require, in most cases, a lot more current from your amp. They don't need a lot of voltage, they need a lot of current, a lot more than dynamic driver headphones, and therefore you need an amp that is capable of putting out higher wattage. Some planar magnetic headphones need a minimum of 2 or 3 watts per channel out of your amp to get decent sound out of them. And the little Hi-Fi Man HE400 SE that sells for only $109, it's a great sounding headphone for the money, but it needs a lot of power. I recommend a couple watts per channel into that, where dynamic driver headphones of a similar price are going to need far less power, you know. So, and then you've got headphones like the Hi-Fi Man HE6, and that needed, I mean, a lot. That needs so much power that a lot of people, and I mean a lot, I see this every day on my headphone group, people take speaker amps up to like 100 watt per channel speaker amps into 8 ohms and hook their headphones directly to the speaker taps and use that to drive headphones like the HE6. I mean, people are even doing that with the $6,000 Susvara and having great results. But these headphones, I've heard the HE6 can require as much as 20 watts per channel to really sound good, you know, to really get a full solid bass. But they might be listening to it pretty loud at that wattage. Anyway, up until probably about 2 years ago, there were very few closed back planar magnetic headphones, but now they're getting much more common and the price is coming down, so that's a disadvantage that's sort of going away over time. even though the planar magnetics have usually have very good extension into the bass, not all cases, but very few planar magnetic headphones have punchy mid bass. One exception I can think of is the Hi-Fi Man Aria Stealth. It has a very punchy mid bass, but there are very few that do have that. The Kennerton Rogner, depending which pads you put in, mine came with 3 sets of ear pads. Depending which ear pads you put on, you can get pretty solid dynamic bass out of it, but with other ear pads it's less so. But in general, I would say dynamic headphones have more weight and more punch to the mid bass. Some people complain about or feel that planar magnetic headphones just are too fast, that the diaphragms just react too fast and you don't get natural decay on some of your instruments and it doesn't sound natural, or that it's just too detailed that once again it just doesn't sound natural. So like I said earlier, that I'd say most people, including myself, think the dynamic driver headphones do sound a little more natural than the planar magnetics. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is a disadvantage, and I did mention this earlier when I was talking about the dynamic drivers, is open back planar magnetic headphones leak a huge amount of sound. Whatever you're hearing on the inside, the people in the room are going to hear on the outside. Obviously their ears aren't as close, so they're not going to hear it as loud, but they're going to usually hear open back planar magnetic headphone is putting out just as much sound outward as it is inward, and the people around you are going to hear that minus the bass. They won't hear the bass, so they're going to hear this high, just the highs and mids, and it's very annoying to some people. I know my girlfriend doesn't like to hear my open back headphones, and I've heard multiple, I mean dozens, maybe hundreds of people discussing on headphone groups that because of people in their home, spouse, children, or whatever, just don't like the open back headphones. So that is why the main reason people want closed back headphones is to keep the music in. But now planar magnetic headphones are becoming available in closed back, so you don't always have to go to dynamic drivers with closed back. So anyway, I think that covers most of the advantages and disadvantages of both types of headphones. So I'm going to wrap this up. And my next video in this 4-part series is going to be a comparison between solid state headphone amps and tube headphone amps. So I hope to get that out in a couple weeks, and I've got some more equipment reviews coming up. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. Once again, this is William from the Headphone Experience. If this video has helped you, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And the Headphone Experience on Facebook is up to, I believe, 17.3 thousand members. I think it's grown like 500 members in the last 2 weeks. It's growing really fast right now. So I'd like to see you all over there. You're all welcome to join us. And once again, thanks for watching my video.